Anything that is alive has got to be pruned in order to thrive. Now, what I want to do is I want to morph the concept of pruning from the problem category that you have to do sometime if something's not working to a normal strategy to make anything thrive. Number one, you prune it because a bush has more buds than it can sustain. A lot of times, leaders have a bunch of things that their company is into that they don't really have to cut because it's profitable and it's doing okay, but it's really not on mission. The second scenario when they prune is that there are branches that are sick and they're not going to get well. Now, if you're a good gardener, you fix sick branches. But hey, after you've done everything and it's still sick and it's not getting well and you've done everything there is to do, you know what they do? They snip it. And then the third category is there's a bunch of stuff that's dead branches that are basically just in the way. So I want you to begin to think about how diligent am I pruning? Because a lot of times leaders are about the future and creating the new buds, but there's a lot of resources available for those new buds that they're passing up on because they're not doing the pruning. You got to make a couple of mind shifts in order to do this. The first thing that I find that leaders have to do is they've got to make this normal. You know, some people recognize that everything has a season. Like I know a lot of people in the development business in real estate, and you know, with the downturn in the last handful of years, you saw a lot of developers who, when things were going up, what did they do? They just bought land all over the place, right? Because they deluded themselves into thinking that was going to last forever. And people expand and they add overhead and they do all this stuff, not recognizing that I've got to plan for how am I going to do my pruning, because when this thing does turn, I don't want to be stuck holding all this infrastructure and holding all this land, this and the other. And they see it as normal part of business planning and normal part of functioning. What that also does when you see it as normal is you're looking at what already exists to begin to do this as well. So I want you to normalize it instead of, oh no, I need to cut something just because, you know, the person's an idiot or, you know, some really bad, big, ugly thing. No, this is a normal thing. Okay, that's the first thing. But the second thing is there's got to be some personal shifts inside the leader. One of the classic ones is that some people, because they're loving and kind and values-driven, people-oriented leaders, that to start to prune stuff, what's going to happen? You're going to hurt some people. Now, I'm just going to say that again. When you start pruning things, you know, when you clip the bush, if the bush were, you know, had feelings and could talk about it, you would see a wince, right? Because you got clipped. Well, when you clip things in your company, there's going to be some wincing. People aren't going to like it. It's going to hurt. But the shift that loving leaders often have to make is they learn or have to learn the distinction between hurting someone versus harming them. Now let's talk about the people side of this for a second. In here, for example, or maybe even in here, there's some people that might have to go away. And, you know, we don't want to do that because they've, you know, it just hurts. And can't we make it better for them? But you've tried and you've tried. And the reality is that what's being demanded of that position is more than that person can deliver. Now I'm going to say that again. What's being demanded of that position is more than that person can deliver. So what you've got is you've got a gap between here's what we need and here's the reality of what the person can do. And this gap you are paying for, your constituents are paying for, your equity partners are paying for. And here's what you don't recognize. When you have a person that's in over their heads, they're really paying for it too. Because they're constantly getting nagged. They're constantly knowing that they're not kind of living up to what they need to live up to. Sometimes that's because of something that they could change, but they're not changing it. And sometimes the best thing that you can do is you can do like the proverb says, the wounds of a friend are better than the kisses of an enemy. You know, enemies will flatter you, friends will tell you the truth. And sometimes to relieve that person of that position and say, you know what, I love you. You've been around here forever. We're friends and I care about what happens to you. The reality is this is not the right position for you and it's not the right position for the company. I want you to thrive. I don't think you're going to thrive in this position. That's going to hurt. Like you go to the dentist, you pull a tooth, it's going to hurt. But in the end, it's going to be the best thing for them because then they're going to either go back and grow somewhere and get to where they can do that, or they're going to find out, I am so glad a year later. And I've heard literally people say this. One executive, when I was talking about this, one CEO told me, I just had this happen. I said, what? She said, I just had somebody from my former company call me and ask me to go to, that I fired, call me and ask me to go to lunch. And I thought, oh no, I gotta come hear this, you know, it's gonna be ugly because I know it was difficult for them. Now I gotta hear what a villain I was. She said, but I went ahead and did it, sat down at lunch, and here's what the guy said. I just wanted to get together with you because I want to thank you for what you did for me. She said, what? I fired you. He said, I know. And it was really hard at the time and I didn't take it that well. He said, but the reality was I was miscast for that position. I had been in that line for like 10 years and I just didn't have the courage myself to make the change. And in the last year, I went back and I got another license and something else. And he just lit up like a Christmas tree, she said, because he was thriving, because she had made the hard decision. So sometimes you've got to make a shift that what might be hurtful is not harmful. We don't want to harm anybody. So you got to be careful in the way that you prune, that you're not harming them and attacking and adversarial and all of that, and the way that you let people go and the way you shut things down and the way you do layoffs. I've heard horror stories about people being harmed in pruning. But there are good ways to do that where it hurts, but what you've done is actually done them a favor. And that's great, but you've done something also that's really your, primary calling, and that's you've been a steward. As the CEO or whoever it is, whatever your position is, it means you're the steward or over something. That term C means chief for a reason. That everybody is counting on you to make sure the mission of this organization is preserved. Now, you want to preserve the people in the process, the people. That doesn't mean always that you preserve their position or their job or even that product line. And some of these things are hurtful. Now, the other part of this that I find that people have to do is, this would be C. Point D is, what are we pruning towards? Okay? You gotta have a target. A gardener knows what a rose bush is supposed to look like. And so when he goes along and looks at these buds and knows what a healthy bud looks like, and they start to prune them, they know what they're looking for, and that's not it, so it goes away. Remember the story of Jack Welch at GE when he took it from this big to that big? Well, he was a pruner, but he had a target. And what he said was, we're going to prune anything that cannot, they were in like 200 businesses. And he said, any business or business unit that cannot be number 1 or 2 in its market, we're going to get rid of. And then about the sick, not getting well ones, he said, if something's not working, then there's 3 possibilities. You're going to fix it, or you're going to shut it down, or you're going to sell it. But we're not going to let it keep taking up resources. So what you've got to do is you got to have a target. So that's a good target, 1 or 2 in the market, or fix it, close it, sell it. or whatever your target is. Maybe you want to be at a certain level of revenues or a certain level of returns or whatever, or that division goes away, or somebody is having so many sales or this, that, and the other. But you'll never prune well if you haven't really defined what the target that you're pruning towards is. Okay, so that's what pruning is about. And I hope as you kind of talk about this, you'll see a couple things. Gardening is not just for, the train wrecks. Gardening is diligent application of leadership on an ongoing basis. So I would want you to think about, how do we get the pruning function into the DNA of our executive committee? How does the CEO get it into the DNA of the way that they look at everything? And then how do we get it into the DNA of everybody that's a boss inside the company? Because you want to be doing this and taking stewardship as time goes on, which brings us to the other point. If we're going to do that, I got to grow. I mean, I might have to get some help or some coaching or something to help me get over the hump of being able to have these conversations. I may have to go have some communication training, how to have difficult confrontations, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing ever that leaders have to do that doesn't require a leader being whole and being a person of integrity, which means to be integrated and be whole in order to pull it off. So there's a good challenge. Here's a good vision. I promise you the great leaders are great pruners, and the ones that avoid this, the bush just tends to languish. I want you to be a great pruner so you'll be a great leader. One of the biggest problem scenarios we see in pruning is when you have to prune in a crisis because you haven't been pruning all along. It's sort of like the guy that wakes up in the middle of the night with an abscessed tooth and has to call the oral surgeon and go right then, basically because they hadn't had their teeth cleaned in 14 years or gone to the dentist on a regular basis, right? And sometimes this happens. Sometimes this happens because of market things that change that you couldn't see coming. But the big question about this is, along the way, you want to be pruning along the way, like I said, diligently before the crisis occurs. And that is a huge, huge aspect of leadership called creating urgency. In Necessary Endings, I talk about getting to the pruning moment, and there's a couple of components to this that are really, really important, especially, and here's the danger, especially in companies that are doing well, because the biggest deterrent to somebody pruning is that things are going well. My tooth doesn't hurt. I can go play golf today. Why should I go to the dentist? Well, that's not what leaders do. What leaders do is they create urgency around the vital before it's a crisis. And leadership is about creating heat and creating urgency for people to change and meet the standards and use the standards to prune before they're ever backed up against a corner. And this is why all these pruning processes become very, very important in the DNA of a team and an organization. So you never find yourself in a crisis that is at least of your making. It needs to come from the outside world if you're going to be in one. And that means that you're creating urgency around pruning in various ways along the way.